My friend Katie and I decided to meet at our favorite coffee shop on a weekday evening. That particular day was a bit cloudy with light rain, and a hot beverage with a blueberry muffin seemed like a great idea. We had both taken a break from studying, and the fresh chicory aroma there was always quite alluring. The coffee shop we liked the best was located at the end of a medium-sized retro indoor mall, about 3 miles from my home. It was a place that got a lot of in and out traffic, and new faces were pretty constant. We considered it a fairly safe haven in a world of news about perpetual murders, rapes, armed robberies, and all kinds of other crimes we had all become far too desensitized to. When I arrived around 5 o'clock with my book bag in hand, I noticed Katie had already snagged one of the corner booths for us, and her laptop was fired up. Her face had a mild glow from the bright screen of the computer. I announced my presence as I took my seat across from her. "Hey," she replied, giving me her standard, deep in thought, half smile. That was just her personality, and it didn't bother me. I already knew by her demeanor she was either reading a compelling email or an instant message. I unpacked my laptop and my purse and volunteered to go over to the counter and get our coffee. The shop had a decent crowd for a weekday, with about 10 people scattered amongst the booths and tables. I ordered my usual pumpkin spice and her peppermint chocolate, which always smelled like Christmas to me. I also asked for one of the last 2 blueberry muffins in the case, paid for everything, and returned to the booth. Katie sipped her coffee with enthusiasm, and began complaining to me about this project she would have to do for a fine arts class that semester. It sounded like it was going to take a lot more time than she initially expected. The conversation eventually switched to our mutual friend, Hannah, who was struggling through a relationship with her boyfriend of 2 years, Ethan. Katie was in the middle of telling me about Hannah's latest drama, which I admit, piqued my curiosity, when I had that rare strange feeling that someone was watching me in a weird kind of way. I glanced over Katie's left shoulder and noticed a scruffy bearded man with a stained baseball cap staring right at me. He had a short, thick, very identifiable scar just above his left eyebrow. There were stares and there were stares. His stare was definitely a different type of stare, the kind of eerie stare that seemed to look right through me. Suddenly I was only hearing certain words and phrases as Katie kept talking, something about Ethan, a football game, and an unreturned text. Finally, when she sensed I was not fully concentrating on what she had to say, she asked me if there was something wrong. I apologized, and told her about the guy who still remained staring. He looked around 40 years old, and had an absolute lonely persona about him. Just short of what we'd normally refer to as an outright creep. I asked Katie not to turn around as it might encourage him to walk over. My hand shook a little as I reached for my coffee, and I decided that I would do my best to ignore him. I forced myself to look directly at her. Katie began talking again, and this time I tried really hard to concentrate on exactly what she was saying. I remained focused until her cell phone rang, which actually startled both of us. While Katie spoke to what turned out to be her sister, Elise, she inadvertently stood up and exited our booth, giving me a direct view of the man again. He was still staring right at me, almost as if he was frozen in place. At that very point, I felt the need to use the restroom. I also mustered a small degree of courage, as I guess that automatically happens when nature calls. I motioned to Katie as to where I was going and she gave me a reassuring nod. Since the restroom was located straight ahead and to the right, I was going to have to walk past the man. I stood up and prepared myself. I decided I would begin with my own stare, straight at the far wall ahead. I had also determined that if he tried to speak to me I would just give him the quick, not interested wince. With each step I moved closer. I could still feel his stare the entire way, but as I walked past he did not say a word. Without looking back I entered the ladies' restroom with some relief and stepped into the first of the 2 empty stalls. I slid the door latch when I heard someone else walk in. The steps were light, and just like that my fear came back. Had this man followed me into the restroom? Whoever it was pushed lightly against my stall's door. I remained silent and began to pray that someone else would soon walk in. The person finally moved to the second stall, and I heard its door squeak closed. I was ready to run out of there yelling when I heard a light sigh and I realized it was another female. My entire body was filled with instant relief. When I exited the restroom, the first person I encountered was one of the shop's young workers, who was busy emptying a garbage can. She leaned over and warned me that the staring guy had been indiscreetly watching me earlier. I acknowledged that I already knew about him. As I walked back toward my booth, I could see the back of his head. Then I noticed something else quite strange. There was another creepy man sitting at a small table against the wall. He was wearing a flimsy Panama-looking hat, dark square glasses, and gloves, and he appeared to be staring right at the man who had been staring at me. This other man had a cold type of presence, and though I couldn't see his eyes, his mannerism seemed a bit diabolical. I returned to the booth and saw Katie was off of her phone. She joked about me going to talk to my secret admirer, and I abruptly told her the comment wasn't funny. We both finished our coffees and she told me she had to pick up some money from her sister. I insisted that we walk out together. The worker who had given me the earlier warning told us bye, and gave me another look as if to alert me again. We made it outside, and though the light rain had stopped, the parking lot was still very wet. We walked over to Katie's car and noticed there was a running truck partially blocking her in. As she walked over to the cab of the truck, I spun around to look back at the mall. The weird guy in the coffee shop had also moved outside, and was staring at me again. He was maintaining a good distance away from me, which was somewhat of a relief. I displayed my cell phone as a type of deterrent. I pretended I didn't see him, instead moving my head back and forth and giving a sweeping look all around. That's when I also noticed the other guy in the hat and dark glasses was also outside and leaning against the partially opened door of a car. He was secretly staring at the other man just as he had in the coffee shop. Katie walked back over and told me the truck was moving. So the original plan was for both of us to get into her car, drive to the other side of the mall, then loop around and let me out next to my car. I told her to cut her car's lights initially, hoping this would conceal her license plate. I glanced in the side mirror and I could still see the other man watching the man who was staring at me. Katie took off fast, and we drove across the parking lot around to the other end. Once we were convinced nobody had followed us, she returned to the area using the far lane. She pulled up to my car, and I hopped out real quick and hit my door unlock button. I jumped in, and flung my book bag onto the passenger seat, then locked the doors. By the time I got it started, Katie was driving off. I backed out of my spot and began to drive home. After about 2 blocks I realized I hadn't even checked the back of my car to see if someone was hiding there. This was the second time that night I felt the real rush of fear. I had seen all of the movies and heard all of the stories. I actually cut across 2 lanes, and pulled into a brightly lit fast food parking lot and parked. It was the only time I had hoped that a policeman had seen my traffic violation. I jumped out with a bit of a yell, and several people walking into the restaurant looked at me as if I was crazy. But at the same time there was instant relief. Nobody was in the back of my car. I looked around and then got back in the car and drove home. Katie did call me later that night to make sure I was safe. She also joked about the staring guy again, and that time I did sort of laugh it off with her. I also mentioned that maybe we needed to stay away from that coffee shop for a while. About 6 weeks later, I happened to be watching the local evening news with my mom, something I didn't do very often, partly out of rebellion against the sick world we lived in. The lead story was an investigative report about the third straight murder that fit a certain gruesome pattern. The reporter was making a serial parallel. A picture of a young, unkempt man with a drifter type of lifestyle represented the most recent victim. Near the end of the report, pictures of the first two victims were posted, and I suddenly felt a sense of shock and disbelief. The scruffy man with the scar above his eyebrow, who was staring at me in the coffee shop, was victim number 2. I immediately recognized him. His past had apparently included several sexual assaults and a rape charge from over a decade earlier. Initially I didn't mention anything to my mom. Instead I went online and ultimately found an article describing how he was murdered, and checked the date he was discovered. After verifying things with Katie, I realized it was within 24 hours of our coffee shop meeting. It suddenly occurred to me that the other creepy man I saw staring at him was actually stalking him, and was probably the serial killer they were looking for. I went to the police station and met with a police detective and told him about my experience. The problem was I could only give him a broad description of the other man, which had already matched the generic suspect description based on general profile experience with those type of crimes. And it was far too late for them to pull any video that might have captured a better image or even his vehicle. The entire ordeal made me sick and dizzy. The guy staring strangely at me was indeed a sexual predator. And the other guy staring bizarrely at him was probably a serial killer. I wondered if it would have made a difference if Katie and I had been a little bold and called the police to interrogate the guy on the spot. Maybe that would have made the other guy feel uneasy. We will never know. But the final conclusion was awfully clear. I was being stalked by someone who was actually being stalked by someone else who was seemingly far more dangerous. It's a horrifying experience that I will never forget.